Good morning and welcome to WNHH Radio's Dateline New Haven. I'm your host, Paul Bass, inviting you to look behind the headlines on the stories that make New Haven tick. Monte Frank makes our whole state tick. Last time he was here at WNHH, he was running for lieutenant governor. Today he returns because he's been biking, not running, all the way to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania and back to call attention to the Tree of Life synagogue massacre and the issue of gun violence. We'd like to thank New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. Monte Frank, welcome back.
Nice to be back.
It is great to see you, and I can't wait to talk about this great bike trip you took for 6 days, 600 miles. But I think, as you reminded me as you came in, on a more somber note, and it was a very serious reason you went on this ride, you're here a day after another deadly school shooting right near Columbine High School, where this whole modern era of public consciousness over gun massacres began. Any thoughts on yesterday's shooting?
You know, every time there's a school shooting, it takes me right back to what happened in my town in 2012. It's just another kick in the stomach and another reminder that, we've got a lot of work to do to reduce gun violence, prevent school shootings, prevent continued urban violence. We're over 6 years since the Sandy Hook shooting, and I feel in some ways we are going backwards because the shootings just continue.
Yeah. I'll tell you my reaction that I've been noticing lately, because these massacres happen pretty recently. And not all massacres, sometimes not everybody dies, but some kind of scary situation where another crazed person, probably mentally ill, influenced by crazy stuff on the internet, looking for glory, not treated by the mental health system, whatever the reasons. People are walking into places we considered safe and just randomly shooting at unarmed people. Unarmed and just random people. And so I've been thinking, Monte, about how it enters our consciousness. In Newtown, we all remember that great photo taken by the local photographer of the kids being let out. And that, in your town in Newtown, when the kids were massacred at Sandy Hook, everyone noticed, everyone paid attention worldwide. In the last week and a half alone, there was the synagogue shooting in Poway outside San Diego, California. Then there was the university shooting. Was that University of Virginia? No.
North Carolina.
North Carolina. You see, not all written. And then yesterday we had it near Columbine. So I noticed that in the Poway shooting, of course we cared, but it wasn't the top story most of the time. And the New York Times, for instance, we were looking online in the paper, it was like number 7. I was wondering why that was, because when the Tree of Life synagogue massacre happened last year, that was top story. Then the University of North Carolina shooting happened, and that wasn't the top story, but that got higher attention. And then yesterday seemed to get some attention, but it seems like we're becoming a little bit of nerd to it, but that it might even be not the wrong news judgment, because what sets them apart, it's becoming routine. So in Poway, some other guy shot up a synagogue, and this time only one person died, only.
Right. Luckily.
Yesterday I think might have gotten more attention because this all started with Columbine, and that was a few miles away. Any thoughts on how this enters our consciousness and how we're reacting to what's becoming a numbing stream of these shootings?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. One, I think it is becoming the new normal, and we can't let it be. Because the proliferation of gun violence in our communities, whether it's in New Haven or Hartford or Bridgeport, or the school shootings, are not normal. This is not how a normal civilized society ought to act. And when it does occur, there ought to be a reaction to it rather than inertia. So that's part of it. I think another part of it is that we've allowed the process around trying to enact gun laws to become a wedge issue, that it's become so polarized and politicized that the majority of the people are being drowned out, and they're kind of throwing up their hands and saying, "There's nothing we can do here. We just have to accept it." And that is the wrong answer. And when I was running for lieutenant governor, I had a lot of conversations with people who would come up to me and say, "Hey, we really like Oz. We ought really
That's
ought
the
to
guy
think,
you ran with.
yeah,
Oz Griebel, the
Oz
Governor
Griebel,
candidate.
former Republican, ran for governor as a Republican." So in typical Republican households, they would come up to me and say, "We really like Oz. We're really worried about you because of your views on gun policy." And when you had the conversations, 9 out of 10 times, there was a common set of principles that people agreed with.
Well, see, we have this belief. I believe you and I are probably in this category, and we might be wrong. We might be right. That on this issue, like other wedge issues, most people in America would agree with most steps that could be taken. In this case, I'm thinking specifically, I don't think most people would have a problem with someone's just beat up his partner and they say he shouldn't have a gun while there's a restraining order. Most people would believe there should be background checks on everybody. Am I right? And what are those points of agreement in the households you found?
So if you look at a background check on all firearm sales, according to the Quinnipiac poll, it's oscillated somewhere between 92% and 97%.
But we don't have it
of Americans. But the process has become so political in Washington that we can't get it through Congress. And if we were to get it through Congress, there's a strong likelihood that our current president would veto it. And I think it begs the question as to whether or not we've gone about the effort to, on the political side, reduce gun violence appropriately. If you look back on how prior movements have gained momentum, the civil rights movement in the 60s, more recently with the LGBTQ community, there was a cultural change, and then the politicians followed. And we've focused so heavily on changing Washington and working at the state houses, and we've had a lot of success at some state houses, particularly in Connecticut. But the cultural battle hasn't really been fought, and that was one of the reasons we decided.
It has been fought. Your side, our side lost. The NRA has made this a cultural battle that if you're not for unadulterated gun use, and now they're getting support in the Supreme Court for a brand new radical view of the Second Amendment, which is that the rights of a militia are now conveyed to every single citizen to be a personal militia, to have all the guns he or she wants. I mean, I would argue, Monte, that there has been a cultural war waged. Only one side has fought it, and that side has won.
They certainly have the lead on the cultural side to date.
Even though in polls, as you argue, upwards of 90% of people agree on some common sense solutions. I think you're right. It's about culture.
It's about culture. And so, that's why we decided this year, for the first time after riding to Washington for 6 years, that we were going to ride to Pittsburgh. So we did our normal route where we went down to Baltimore, stopping in small towns and big cities along the way. And then we took a right and went through, the heart of Pennsylvania.
I love took a right means you went hundreds of miles out of your way up some hills that I would never want to ride on. Let's say who we are. We are Team 26.
We are Team 26.
What is Team 26?
Team 26 was formed by me and some friends from the cycling community after the shooting on 12/14 to honor the 20 children and 6 educators that were murdered at the Sandy Hook School, and to raise awareness about the gun violence epidemic that plagues our country. For 6 years, we rode down to Washington, stopping, it was a 400-mile rolling rally. So, we stop places like Peekskill and Morristown and Trenton, New Jersey, and the University of Delaware and Philadelphia. And then we arrive City Hall in Baltimore for usually a meeting with the mayor and the police department and public health officials. And then we traditionally would go down to Washington, where we would be greeted by mostly entirely leadership from the Democratic Party. And and there's some wonderful leaders. Mike Thompson, representative from California, who chairs the gun violence task force, would always come out and greet us, and is working very hard to get bills through Congress, but has been stymied. We've got a set of bills through the House in this Congress, but the Senate won't even call them to a vote. So, we decided that, what we do best is to raise awareness and unite communities and remember all victims of gun violence, particularly the 26 from Newtown. So we decided we're going to ride to the Tree of Life and try to bring in the faith-based community into the discussion. Have some new events in places like Gettysburg and then in Pittsburgh, which is what we did.
That's a lot of riding. You got a lot of energy. I remember that from last time. How many people go on Team 26 ride?
We had about 25 going down to Baltimore, and then we scaled back to about 14 riders from Baltimore to
Are they all from
Pittsburgh.
Newtown?
No, from all over the country. I've got people coming in from South Carolina and Texas and Vermont and, places that are traditionally.
And how many miles? 600 miles, 6 days. You go 100 miles a day.
Many days we did more than 100 miles. So the last day in Pittsburgh was only about 70, but every other day was 100 plus. We did a total of about 630 miles in 6 days, with one rest day in Baltimore to do some work in that city. Just put it in perspective. A lot of people train to do a century. We were doing a century every day, with a bunch of events in between. Our fifth day, which was, after we had about 400 miles in our leg, was 126 miles with almost 11,000 feet of climbing up and over the Alleghenies. And
I don't even like riding up the little hill in Westville when I go home. Guys, how do you do all those hills?
I mean, I've been racing for a long time, and the people who ride are pretty accomplished. We had a couple high school kids with us. We had some college kids with us. We're trying to get younger. And
how old are you, Monte?
I'm 50.
Oh, 50 years old. You're going 100 miles a day up these hills. Was there ever a point you say, okay, I don't think I can make this one anymore?
When you're riding for,
you get tired, right?
Of course you get tired, but when you're riding for something that's bigger than yourself and you're riding with a group of people who care about the issues, the miles click by pretty quickly, and the pain goes away.
Oh,
yeah. I mean, it's been a tough year for me, and I remember, I lost my mother, and with the Jeremy Richmond suicide, and one of our teammates suddenly died on April 1st. So it's been a rough year. And in the middle of this ride, I turned to one of my team members and I said, I haven't smiled this much in a long time. But it's all about
important to keep smiling.
Yeah, it's all about being out on the road and being with your teammates. It's like a family, and trying to raise awareness about something that is life-threatening for many of us. And
we're talking about the epidemic of gun violence in our city. We're talking about mass shootings, and we're talking with someone who, ever since there was a mass shooting in his hometown of Newtown, Connecticut, has led an annual bike ride. First down to Baltimore, Washington, and now to Pittsburgh, to raise awareness, unite community, remember all victims of gun violence. He's Monte Frank. He's from Team 26, and he's here on Dateline New Haven and WNHH 102.5, live streams at newhavenindependent.org. Alex Taubes, thanks for listening, Alex, writes in, half of all guns, 130 million guns, are owned by 14% of gun owners, or 7.6 million people. I never knew that, Alex. That's 3% of the U.S. population. What do we make of that? Some ways, does it make the number seem not as big because it's one person? Is it like those 40 guns aren't 40 people? Or does it mean these are some scary individuals who are ready to commit massacres and can't be stopped?
Well, I think there are 2 points. One is, what we're finding is that there are a smaller number of people who have, large caches of weapons in their house. I mean, if you look at what happened in Newtown, the shooter and then mom had a lot of firearms that could do a lot of damage. That's part of it. And then the second piece of it, it is so easy to acquire a firearm in this country that you don't need to have a huge storage of weapons in your house. You know, in many states, you can walk into a gun show, and it's a private transaction. There are no questions asked. You pull out a little bit of money and you walk out with firearms that can do a lot of damage to a lot of people. You know, we know that you know, in Chicago, for example, which has fairly strict gun laws, you know, most of their crime guns are coming from Mike Pence's Indiana and Paul Ryan's Wisconsin. And yet, you know, that slow moving massacre that occurs in Chicago, many of our cities, continues because of the lax federal gun laws. And
So, do a lot of people in Chicago and other cities kill people with guns that originated for sale at these gun shows in other states?
oh, absolutely. And we know, for example, in Connecticut, that most of our crime guns are coming from the South, or they're coming down from Vermont or New Hampshire or Maine, where they don't have the same requirements that we have in Connecticut. And that's why it's so important that we focus on the cultural change that will then drive the changes in federal law that are necessary.
Margaret Hall Conlin writes in, thank you for listening, Margaret. Enough is enough. Go Monte and Team 26 ride like Dave. So I noticed, Monte, when you speak about the challenge, you talk about massacres in schools and places like that, and you always add urban violence. I get the sense that's deliberate, that when you're thinking about uniting people behind common sense gun control, you're looking at two very different groups of people. So Newtown was a horrific, horrible massacre. 26 people killed at a school, 20 children, and the whole nation mourned. And then I remember being in an African-American church the weekend after where they said, of course, our hearts go out. This is horrible. Hearts never go out for the many more children who are killed in our communities, picked off one by one, two by two, because they're happening in a city, often with guns coming from suburbs, but separate from that. Is that why you always make sure every sentence ends with that, and why just now you're bringing up Chicago?
I do, and it's deliberate. After the shooting in Newtown, when I had many nights where I just couldn't sleep, and
were there a lot of people you knew who were killed?
Yeah, and
did it touch your family?
My 11-year-old, that night, having to explain to my 11-year-old daughter that her third grade teacher, Vicky Soto, who was, you know, wonderful teacher, my daughter was close to her, had been murdered, is a conversation that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life.
Was she in the school that day?
She was not. She was in 6th grade, so she was about a year and a half out.
So how did you tell her?
I sat her down and I said to her, you know, you've heard about what happened at Sandy Hook today. You know, we know that Vicky was one of the victims, and you know, she went into her room, put her head under the pillow. You know, about 20 minutes later, she came down with her dance bag and said, "Dad, take me to dance." And that whole dance community, which is Bridgeport Trumbull based, put her arms around her and got her through it. And so, you know, I'm grateful to that. But, you know, those conversations were occurring throughout our community. And yet we were the lucky ones, right? Because we still had our kids. And so, you know, those conversations were horrible. I represent the town. So
as an attorney,
so, you know, I was very involved with a lot of what's going on. And as I read more and more about the epidemic of gun violence and how it affects our urban communities, you know, I knew that while we were getting all the attention in Newtown, the mass shootings, while they're horrible, are only a small segment of gun violence in our country. So we had a horrible day. We lost 26 people. You know, that's a month in Baltimore. That's a weekend in Chicago. You know, we called ourselves Team 26, but we easily could have called ourselves Team 26,000. And that would not come close to the number of gun violence deaths in our country each year. So, yeah, I mean, one of the reasons we went to Baltimore was to shine a light, you know, that first year was to shine a light on the gun violence epidemic that plagues our urban environments. I've made a point of uniting communities, trying to give a voice to the Hartford community, for example, and Mothers United Against Violence. I go to their marches. I bring them to our events so that people understand that it's all related, it's all important, and we've got to focus on both.
Monte Frank, leader of Team 26, group from coming out of Newtown, but groups of riders from all over the country. This year took a 630-mile ride, their annual ride, to call attention to gun violence in our country, raise awareness, unite community, and remember all victims of gun violence. So, Monte Frank, you added Trio Pittsburgh, where a man who was upset about Jewish support for refugees walked into a synagogue on Shabbat morning and just started killing people. What happened when you went there? What'd you do?
So we went right to the Tree of Life Synagogue. We were greeted there by members of the Jewish community. The vice president of the synagogue greeted us there and brought us right to the fencing, which is literally within 5-6 feet in front of the entrance to the synagogue, and told us stories about each of the 11 people that were murdered. And then we said Kaddish. So I said the mourner's prayer, the mourner's Kaddish for my mother, and for Jeremy and our teammate Dave, and for the 11 people that were murdered. It was an amazing experience, very emotional, very moving. Locking arms and embracing the Jewish community there, and uniting Sandy Hook with Squirrel Hill.
This is the Jewish neighborhood.
Was very powerful.
The Kaddish prayer is so interesting to me because it doesn't mention death. It's written in Aramaic, not Hebrew for the most part, except for the last part. And it calls on people to praise God and basically embrace life at a moment when it's the hardest to do.
Right.
When someone is killed for no apparent reason, it seems so unjust. That's not really the time you're most likely to say there's some God, I believe, some sense of the universe, something beyond me that can be positive, that gives me a reason to keep living.
Right.
And, because I sometimes go to the homes where we do Kaddish, we have a minion for the prayer for the people who lost someone. And that is the moment that they have people around them to stand up and say that prayer, so that community is with you to say, go on. So many things, you talk about your daughter going to the dance class and they all unite around her. So when you said the prayer at Tree of Life, how many people were around you and how many people were saying the prayer?
We probably had about 50 people there. I would say there were probably about 15 of us, just guessing, who were saying the prayer.
What day of the week was it?
Thursday.
And what stories did you hear about Pittsburgh that resonated from your experience in Sandy Hook?
6 months after the shooting at the Sandy Hook school, I remember emotions still being very raw. People very much still mourning, still grieving, and unlike now, there hadn't been many mass shootings up to that point. There were some, and certainly, you had Virginia Tech, and we had a couple riders who were from the Virginia Tech community with us. You had Columbine. You had just had the Aurora shooting, the Aurora Theater shooting. But it didn't seem as if there were a lot of mass shootings up to that point. Now it seems to be almost regular. I think the only difference.
Do you think we hear about them more?
I think there are more of them, and I think they're getting more. I think people who want to commit mass shootings are getting more and more bold and are targeting religious communities, which I think is part of an undercurrent of anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-LGBT community, and those communities are being targeted. The African-American churches are being targeted. And I think part of it is a growth in white nationalism and white supremacy.
Abetted by the White House.
enabled in certain ways, yes, without question. Certainly, the rhetoric that is surrounding the White House has helped that growth, and without question, the what we've seen in the past with unqualified, uh, rebuking of white nationalism and hate crimes.
Now they shut down the group that monitored white nationalists and started a group at the Justice Department to go after alleged black identity extremists, meaning nonviolent people who say Black Lives Matter. They opened a division in the Justice Department to investigate them and closed the division under a guy named Sebastian Gorka, whose only qualifications to come to Homeland Security was he wrote incendiary, untrue things about immigrants to be in charge of shutting down white nationalist investigations.
Yeah, and that's part of what I talked about when we had our event in the heart of Squirrel Hill, where we had faith-based leaders, a survivor of the shooting, mayor's office, all speak. But it's not a coincidence that the shooting at the synagogue, the Chabad house in Poway, was
Is it Poway or Poway?
I think it's Poway, actually.
I don't know.
Was on the 6th anniversary of the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue, the 6-month anniversary. Was during a Yizkor service.
That's when you group all together remember the dead and psychotic.
Right. And then if you look at the shooter's motivation, he was reading the manifesto and
From New Zealand.
And a lot of this white nationalism is really being linked, and it's almost as if you have this undercurrent that is being encouraged to take up arms.
Why do we call it now white nationalism now instead of white supremacy?
That's the same thing. I think it's what white supremacy is probably
Makes it sound more acceptable.
I don't know if it's more acceptable, but to me, they're equal terms, and we ought to do everything we can to squash it before it goes anywhere.
John Board writes in about the Inside the Morning Congress. Thank you for listening, John, and thanks for weighing in on Dateline New Haven. We were talking to Monte Frank, who led Team 26, cyclists from around the country who rode 630 miles, including to Baltimore, Washington, and the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh on an annual ride, expanded to call attention to the epidemic of gun violence in our country. So, Monte, you have these great events. You're calling attention. You're raising awareness. What next? Where do we go? What are the concrete steps that come next to stop gun violence? You talked about culture change, engage people to make it less of a wedge issue. What are the next goals you have?
Well, for Team 26, I mean, we want to continue to push west. And so, we're looking at plans.
Don't tell me you're going to ride more. I'm getting really exhausted thinking of you guys gone already 620 miles.
I think you'll see within a couple of years, we might hit Chicago. And that's really
Will you be able to ride at 53 years old to Chicago?
I sure will.
Wow. Way to go, Monte.
I try to ride every day, and it's just a great way to see things. And I'm still doing a little bit of racing. We'll see if I race this year, but
how about goals on gun control? What kind of laws? Is it about laws, or is it not mostly about laws?
Well, I think there need to be, it's both. There needs to be the cultural shift, right? We need to think about gun violence and fighting gun violence the same way we think about fighting cancer. Mm-hmm. And so I'm involved with a bunch of other things other than Team 26. I'm on the American Bar Association Standing Committee on Gun Violence, and I chair the policy subcommittee. So there's no question that laws are a part of it. But what I would encourage more people to do, particularly the leading gun violence prevention groups, is to really start focusing on the cultural change, so that the changes that we make are not entirely dependent on elections. If you win an election, you get some laws passed. If you lose an election, you go backwards. Again, if it's like fighting cancer, you are passing laws to reduce a public health crisis, and nobody will question it, and there's no risk of going backwards. If it continues to be a political issue and a wedge issue entirely.
In which elitists want to take away the guns from real Americans who want to just defend themselves from black people and Mexicans.
And having a gun is tied to liberty.
Yeah.
And all that waving a flag and all that goes with it.
Like the freedom to have cancer and die a dreadful death.
Exactly.
Okay.
That's where the focus really needs to be. And what was so interesting this year was, in the past, in riding down to Washington, we left Connecticut, we drove, we rode through New Jersey, and we touched, the Philadelphia area, Pennsylvania, and then went into Delaware and then into Maryland before arriving in Washington. So we were hitting areas that it was almost as if we were preaching to the choir. When you go from Baltimore and you stop in Gettysburg, and then you start heading west to Pittsburgh, those are the areas that need our attention. Those are the places where you need to have conversations with people and explain to them, I'm not looking to infringe on your Second Amendment rights. I'm not looking to take away your firearms. I'm not looking to restrict your ability to hunt. I'm not looking to take away the NRA courses on gun safety. I'm not looking to, do anything that inhibits the long-standing gun tradition that we have in this country. But I am looking to make our country safer. I am looking to take the unacceptable rates of gun violence down. I am looking to pass laws so that people who should not have a firearm don't have any ability to acquire one. And when you have those conversations, whether it's in parts of Connecticut or in Pennsylvania or elsewhere, you find very quickly that you see a lot of heads nodding and a lot of agreement. You shake hands and you have some mutual respect. I feel like we've lost that, and that's what needs to be regained.
Monte Frank, I salute you for helping us regain that in this country.
Come ride with us next year, Paul.
10 miles tough for me, Monte Frank. But I salute what you're doing. I salute the work you do with Team 26, the people of Newtown who haven't forgotten the massacre in their town and who move beyond grief to try to make a positive change in our country and have fewer new towns, fewer massacres. Way to go, Monte Frank. Thanks for coming on Dateline New Haven today, and good luck with Team 26.
Thanks, Paul.
I want to thank Yale New Haven Hospital for providing support for today's program. We're going to take it out with the Afro-Semitic Experience performing I Wish I Knew How It Would Feel to Be Free from the group CD, A Plea for Peace. This is Paul Bass inviting you to fly free with us all day and all night long here at WNHH, New Haven's home for community radio.